Two police officers stopped a black man on a quiet, deserted street, accusing him of a crime he hadn't committed. What they didn't know, he was actually the state's chief prosecutor, the very man with the power to expose their lies and the corruption embedded deep within the system. What happened next? No one saw it coming. But before we get to that shocking moment, let's start from the very beginning. David Miller, a tall, confident, middle-aged black man, walked steadily through the peaceful suburban streets of Woodrest. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, he exuded authority and composure. The night air was crisp, and the dim glow of the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. It was late, well past office hours, but David was just heading home after an exhausting day of preparing for a high-profile case. His briefcase, packed with crucial legal documents, felt unusually heavy, though it wasn't the weight of the papers that occupied his mind. Instead, his thoughts raced ahead, strategizing, refining, and anticipating every argument he'd need to make in court the next day. As he rounded the corner, the sudden glare of red and blue flashing lights sliced through the darkness. A police cruiser slowed to a stop beside him, its presence an unspoken warning. David's instincts kicked in immediately. He came to a halt, raising his hands just slightly, enough to appear non-threatening but not so much as to seem submissive. The doors swung open, and two uniformed officers emerged. Officer Barnes, a burly man in his 40s with a smug, knowing smirk, approached first. "Evening," he drawled, his tone laced with skepticism. "What's a man like you doing out here, so late?" David met his gaze steadily, his voice calm yet firm. "Walking home." "Is there a problem, officer?" Barnes exchanged a glance with his younger partner, Officer Grant. The hesitation in Grant's expression was evident. He wasn't as sure about this encounter as Barnes was. But Barnes pressed on. "We got a call about a burglary in the area," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "And guess what? You match the description." David blinked, his brow furrowing. "A burglary? I just left my office downtown. I'm a lawyer." Barnes let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "A lawyer, huh? That's a new one. And what's in the briefcase, then?" "Stolen goods." David could feel the tension thickening in the air. He remained composed. "Legal documents. You're welcome to take a look." Without a second's hesitation, Barnes reached out and snatched the briefcase right from David's hand. "Hey," David started, but Barnes ignored him, flipping it open and rummaging through the neatly arranged papers. "Huh," Barnes mused with mock surprise. "Seems like someone's going out of their way to look innocent." David's patience wore thin. "This is harassment," he stated plainly, his voice edged with controlled frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong." Barnes narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. "That's for us to decide." "Hands behind your back." David's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" "You have no evidence." Barnes didn't answer. He lunged, gripping David's arm with unnecessary force, slapping the cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. "Resisting an officer, for starters," he sneered. "Let's see what else we can add." Grant shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy, but still reached for his radio. "Dispatch bringing in a suspect," he muttered, avoiding David's eyes. David sat stiffly in the back of the police cruiser, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with anger. A slow-burning, righteous fury. He didn't speak. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But one thing was certain, this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. At the station, the air was thick with the stale scent of disinfectant and old coffee. Phones rang in the distance, muffled voices blending into the oppressive atmosphere. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, David was stripped of his belongings, his wallet, his phone, his briefcase. Each item was handled with the careless indifference of someone who had already decided he was guilty. Officer Barnes, still wearing that smirk, busied himself at the processing desk, typing up the charges with a level of enthusiasm that made David's stomach turn. Burglary, resisting arrest, possession of stolen property. Barnes muttered, fabricating details as he went, twisting reality to suit his narrative. Nearby, Grant stood stiffly, arms crossed, his face unreadable. But David saw it, doubt. hesitation, a battle between conscience and complicity. Yet, the younger officer remained silent. Because silence? It was easier than standing up for what was right. David sat alone in a cold holding cell, the steel bars casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. His thoughts stormed, a mixture of disbelief, rage, and grim determination. Just beyond the bars, he could hear Barnes laughing with another officer. "Another one off the streets," Barnes joked, his voice filled with sick satisfaction. Can't wait to see the look on his face when the court throws the book at him. David's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a battle, a personal war against the very injustice he had spent his entire career fighting. But they had no idea who they had just wronged. By morning, David made his one phone call to his legal team, and by noon, his assistant, Rachel, stormed into the station, armed with an unshakable confidence and a thick stack of evidence. The so-called charges? Dismissed. The so-called burglary? Proven false. And Barnes? He wasn't laughing anymore. David walked out of the station, his freedom regained. But this wasn't over. No, not by a long shot. His mind was made up. He wouldn't just clear his own name. He would expose the corruption that nearly took everything from him. A week later, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The seats were packed, spectators, reporters, legal professionals, all eager to witness what was about to unfold. At the prosecution table sat a man who once believed he could manipulate the system to his advantage, Officer Barnes. And, across from him, David Miller, the Chief Prosecutor. Now it was his turn to hold the power. And justice? It was coming. Two officers halted a black man on a dimly lit, quiet street, accusing him of a crime he had no connection to. Little did they know, the man they were trying to intimidate was none other than the state's chief prosecutor, ready to unveil their deceit and the deep-seated corruption within the system. What unfolded next left everyone stunned. But first, let's rewind. David Miller, a tall, middle-aged black man, his crisp navy suit pristine despite a grueling day in court, walked through the tranquil suburban streets of Woodrest. It was late, and the golden glow of streetlights cast elongated shadows along the deserted road. In one hand, he clutched his briefcase, its weight feeling heavier than usual, though his mind was preoccupied with strategizing for an upcoming high-profile case. As he rounded a corner, the sudden flash of blue and red lights pierced the darkness, painting the street in an ominous hue. Instinctively, David halted, raising his hands slightly to signal compliance, though his pulse quickened with an uneasy awareness of what could come next. The police cruiser rolled up beside him, and two officers emerged. "Evening," Officer Barnes greeted with a smug smirk. Stocky and in his 40s, his demeanor radiated cynicism. "What are you doing out here this late?" "Walking home," David replied evenly, keeping his tone measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" Barnes exchanged a knowing glance with his younger partner, Officer Grant, who appeared hesitant. "Got a call about a burglary," Barnes stated, folding his arms. "You match the description." David blinked, his mind racing. "A burglary? I just left my office downtown. I'm a lawyer." Barnes chuckled, his laugh devoid of humor. "A lawyer, huh? What's in the briefcase then?" "Stolen goods." Grant shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. David's voice was firm but controlled. "Legal documents. You're welcome to check." Without waiting for permission, Barnes snatched the briefcase, ignoring David's protest. He rifled through the neatly stacked papers, then scoffed. Well, someone's trying a little too hard to look innocent." "This is harassment," David stated, his patience thinning. "I haven't done anything wrong." "That's for us to decide," Barnes shot back. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "On what grounds?" David demanded. "You have no evidence." Before he could finish, Barnes grabbed him roughly, yanking his arms back and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. "Resisting an officer, for starters," Barnes sneered. "Let's see what else we can add." Grant hesitated but eventually reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we're bringing in a suspect," he muttered, avoiding David's gaze. As David was shoved into the back seat of the cruiser, anger burned through him. not fear, but a seething determination. He vowed this injustice would not go unchecked. At the station, the sterile booking area reeked of stale coffee and disinfectant. Phones rang, voices murmured, but David focused solely on what was happening to him. Barnes, his smirk sharper than ever, took charge of the booking process while Grant lingered by the door, clearly uneasy. David's belongings were taken, his wallet, phone, briefcase, all catalogued with the indifference of someone who had already passed judgment. He was led into a cold, dimly lit holding cell where peeling paint and rusted bars stood as testaments to countless other injustices. Meanwhile, in the adjacent room, Barnes typed up a report that cast David as a dangerous criminal. Burglary, resisting arrest, possession of stolen property. The truth meant nothing. Barnes was simply building a case to justify his own corruption. Grant stood nearby, arms crossed, his jaw clenched. He seemed to wrestle with an inner conflict, but silence was easier than resistance. Compliance came at the cost of justice. Sitting on a hard metal bench, David stared at the floor, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and rage. Through the bars, he could hear Barnes boasting to another officer. "Another one off the streets," he chuckled. "Can't wait to see his face when the court throws the book at him." David's fists clenched. He had spent his career fighting against systemic injustice, and now he had become its latest victim. But he wasn't just going to walk away, he was going to fight. The next morning, David made his one phone call. By noon, his assistant Rachel stormed into the station, armed with a mountain of evidence. Not only did it prove David's innocence, but it also hinted at Barnes' history of misconduct. Within hours, David was released. But that wasn't enough. A week later, a packed courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Spectators, reporters, and legal professionals filled every seat, eager to witness what would unfold. At the prosecution's table, Barnes lounged with false confidence, his smirk unwavering. Beside him, Grant fidgeted, his discomfort clear. Seated between them was Patricia Reynolds, the district's star prosecutor, renowned for her relentless stance on crime. She flipped through her notes, barely glancing at David as he entered. But David walked in like a man in control, his tailored suit and composed demeanor commanding the room's attention. As the judge called the court to order, David stood. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." A wave of astonished whispers swept through the courtroom. Barnes' smirk faltered. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. This wasn't the outcome they had planned for. Over the next hour, David systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. He presented ATM footage with a timestamp proving he was nowhere near the alleged crime scene. Then he dropped the bombshell, an audio recording from the squad car. The courtroom collectively held its breath as Barnes' voice played over the speakers, mocking David and admitting they had no suspect matching the crime. Reynolds' objections came rapidly, but each was overruled. The evidence was undeniable. Finally, David called Grant to the stand. The young officer hesitated, hands trembling as he was sworn in. Under David's pointed questioning, he cracked. "It wasn't right," he confessed. "There was no evidence. Barnes told me to make it look legitimate." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Barnes shot to his feet. "He's lying," he bellowed. But the damage was done. The truth had shattered the false narrative. Reynolds, defeated, requested a recess, but David wasn't finished. Rising once more, he addressed the judge. "There's one last piece of evidence." He approached the bench and handed over a file. "This is my resume." The courtroom fell silent. "Before these officers arrested me without cause, before they fabricated charges, I was preparing for trial," David declared. "Because I'm not just a lawyer. I'm the chief prosecutor of this state." A stunned hush filled the room. Barnes paled. Reynolds looked away. "And I will not tolerate corruption," David continued. "Not in my office. Not in my state. And certainly not from those sworn to uphold the law." Within minutes, the charges against David were dismissed. But the battle was far from over. An internal investigation revealed Barnes' years of misconduct. He was stripped of his badge. Grant, though complicit, cooperated fully and was given a second chance under probation. Weeks later, David stood at a podium before a crowd of reporters. "This isn't just about me," he declared. "It's about a system that allows injustice to thrive. But together, we can change it." The crowd erupted in applause. David stepped back, not just a man vindicated, but a man on a mission. His fight was far from over.